Women's Soccer Review Podcast with Dwayne Rollins and Jonathan Tannenwald on the Sports Podcasting Network.
Welcome to the latest episode of the Women's Soccer Review here on the Sports Podcasting Network. I'm Jonathan Tannenwald of the Philadelphia Inquirer, flying completely solo, except for a guest, on this show. We will take you behind the scenes a little bit under the curtain. In order to produce this recording, we have gotten through a thunderstorm, a dishwasher that knocked our guest's power out, some connection issues with my colleagues, Kevin Laramie and Dwayne Rollins. They're not here. It's just me and our guest, Katie Whyatt of England's Daily Telegraph. She's the women's football reporter over there for that newspaper, and I'm sure it's one, if you follow English football, that you have heard of. It's one of the biggest in the country over there, obviously. They've made a huge investment in covering women's sport, and Katie is at the forefront of it. We met, the two of us, last year when she came to Philadelphia for the She Believes Cup. And for those of you who, like me, who have completely lost track of time, I do mean 2019, not the She Believes Cup of 2 months ago. And Katie was one of the only reporters that did the whole thing at that time, which, as these things go, are not cheap. They aren't now, and they weren't then either. Katie, it is great to have you with us. I've wanted to have you on the show ever since we got this thing started. This is about 6 months that I've been doing this, and you and I have been talking ever since. It's great to finally have you on.
Oh, I feel bad now that I didn't come on earlier. I didn't know you'd been waiting that long.
We're going to talk about the state of women's football in England. Katie is in Bradford. I know this is the first time we've had a true Yorkshire accent on this show. I don't think we've had one on the Sports Podcasting Network overall in a while. The news is we're recording this on Saturday morning, my time, March 23rd. We are all waiting for the FA Women's Super League to announce something. We all expect that the season is going to be, called off from here, basically. And you and a lot of other folks over there have reported that within the league, a lot of the players and coaches and so on, they want the season ended. And that, I'm sure folks over here have heard that news by now, but it still might be a little bit of a surprise to them. So explain why.
I think it's a little bit more mixed than that. I think that there are some players who are quite keen to finish the season. Having spoken to them, they're disappointed by the news that it looks very much like it's going to be curtailed. And then there are some where I think there just haven't been the assurances around safety, and there haven't been the assurances around costs to sort of make it viable for it to come back. So I think that there are certain players and certain clubs that are probably anxious about it, or maybe seeing it as a necessary evil to stop playing out, to maybe preserve their long-term financial health, rather than putting a lot of resources into finishing this season that maybe leaves them vulnerable further down the line.
Our listeners to this show know that we go wading into the muck of football politics and gender and all that fairly often and fairly easily. And I think we're going to end up doing that here. And feel free to say whatever you want, because that's what the part of the joy. Katie, and our listeners know how long I've been doing this for, and one of the nice things about having this podcast is that I can say things that wouldn't necessarily fit concisely in the column inches of the Philadelphia Inquirer. So we're able to go some places here that that get into this stuff. You wrote earlier this month something that got me properly riled up, which is a good thing. The second division club Luz, and I'll quote from your story here, has estimated the cost of completing the remaining 82 Women's Super League and Championship games as around £3 million, a drop in the ocean, as you put it, for the Men's Premier League, but a huge sum for women's football. And then I saw a few days later the press release from the German FA on the resumption of the Frauen Bundesliga, which will be next weekend. And the vice president of the DFB, Hannelore Ratzberg, said, and I quote here, "The continuation of the season is a strong signal for women's football and equal treatment for all professional sports people. We're conscious of the great responsibility which accompanies restarting the season." And then the chairman of the German Federation's Leagues Committee, that's the official title of whatever it is, Siegfried Dietrich said, and quote again here, "Our renewed thanks go to the DFL, which runs the Bundesliga, and their Champions League participants on the men's side, Bayern Munich, Borussia Dortmund, RB Leipzig, and Bayer Leverkusen, who, with their Solidarity Fund, laid the groundwork for the Women's Bundesliga to return." Now, I could continue going on a rant here if I wanted to. But you can guess where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
Look, I'm an Arsenal fan. People know that. My co-host Dwayne Rollins is a Man City fan. Our producer Kevin Laramie is a Chelsea fan. Not necessarily because those three clubs do fairly well by their women's teams, but they do. They should give them credit for that. But I look at some of the other big clubs in England, and I'm going to call out two in particular. And if you're listening and you're a fan of them, I'm sorry, but this is the truth. Liverpool on the men's side is going hell for leather to win the Premier League, but their women's team has been playing the season on a mud patch at Prenton Park, the smaller ground where they play. And then you have, and I'm glad Dwayne is not on the show right now because I'm going to say something that's going to annoy him. Manchester United, the biggest team in England. We know their history with women's football. We know how long it took them to launch a team. We know that 15 of the 20 Premier League clubs have ownership groups with a net worth over $1 billion. And I look at this £3 million figure, and Katie, I just cannot help thinking that there's £3 million in the couch cushions of the executive suites at Old Trafford.
Yeah, I mean, it's a debate. It's got a few different strands to it over here because on one hand, you've got the same issue that's happening with League Two and League One, which are the bottom two divisions of the men's league, of what we consider league football over here before we get further down into the sort of amateur, the word I can never say that word, amateur levels, and then they're having similar problems in that they don't have the money to complete the season, and there's been talks about should the Premier League bail them out and help them out and stuff like that, which is quite similar to the problem that the NWSL has, but then very different because they're not attached to rich men's Premier League clubs. They're not arms of these rich Premier League clubs where the money's kind of knocking about to do that. And it's difficult as well when we were talking before we came on air and you mentioned about would a Sky or a BT not have the money to fund that to broadcast the women's game. And Lewis was very much, that was at the core of their statement, that if a broadcaster came on board could easily drop 3 million into help fund the women's game and then have these games that were being played behind closed doors but broadcast to people all across the country to kind of engage the next generation of fans in the women's game. So that, there are lots of options that are on the table in theory, but then with the broadcasting thing, you're looking at their priority now is that the key broadcasters are in discussions and demanding money back from the Premier League, because if games go behind closed doors, they might use viewers because the atmosphere isn't as good or the season isn't resumed, then what are they going to do? And it's just, it feels to a lot of us that there's a big culture of self-interest with a lot of facets of this rather than necessarily what might be better for women's football or for women's sport. So I think on the one hand it's difficult to criticise because there's been such a growing acceptance for so long that the games are going to be cancelled and the league's not going to go ahead. And it's, I think from a safety perspective, I personally, you said to me you've got to go cover a women's game, I'd be thinking, oh, do I really want to trek across the country to watch a game of football in the current climate? I'm not so sure. So it's something that I think from safety concerns, or players have lost family, or you're having in the Championship particular players who have other jobs and are key workers, can you get them to come back to play a game of football and take them away from the front line or from the other jobs that are keeping the country going at this point? There are so many other ethical questions around it, which present collectively quite a compelling case for not continuing the league. But at the same time, I think people are asking questions of, has every avenue been explored, and how come with the men's Premier League we've had discussions every day about who's going to pay for testing? Is this company that they've chartered to do it, who are going to send so many tests over, and who's going to fund it? And those debates have kind of been happening very publicly, whereas in the women's game I think that there are lots of unresolved questions, and there were no issues about whether there's no discussion about, is there going to be a solidarity fund from the FA to help clubs complete the league? Is there going to be solidarity fund to help them with furloughing, or help them with whatever issues they're going to have when they bring players back? And I don't think that those discussions, from what I understand, ever kind of really took off. But the other part of that is that the FA and the power that the FA and the relationship that the FA has with the Premier League in forcing them to do things is very difficult. So I don't know if you remember, I don't know if this ever became a big thing in America, but when West Ham reached the FA Cup final last year, they had a game, the men's team had a game in the Premier League just a few hours before the cup final, so people were going to have to leave that game early to get to Wembley to support the women's team, and they were petitioning for that to be moved and to be changed. But the FA's limited power over the Premier League meant that realistically, once the Premier League had said, no, we're not moving that game, there was very little wiggle room and room for negotiation, even though games are moved all the time for TV without a second thought for fans' travel plans, or this or that, or scheduling, or season ticket holders, or anything. So I think it's a wider issue in relation to all of this, is that power triangle between the FA, which runs the Women's Super League and is our governing body over here, and then the Premier League and the financial power that has, and the teams within there who are very rich and have women's teams, and then the TV providers and the broadcast providers, and the fact that the women's game doesn't have a paid broadcast deal yet, and is still kind of giving the rights away for free to BT and to the BBC, and the lack of kind of wiggle room that gives women's football.
I'm shaking my head.
I feel like I went on a really long rant there.
No, it's fine. I'm shaking my head. And look, the soccer land, people over here are plenty familiar with a fragmented soccer landscape, both in the United States and Canada, where the National Federation on the men's side does not run any of the men's leagues. Major League Soccer is its own concern. The company it's a company that runs most of the minor leagues over here are its own concern. And, there are various other leagues. We don't have a pyramid over here, as I think like a formal one. So you have all these different leagues that are various different scales, and they're all run by different entities. So people are used to that over here, and the men's and the women's league not always talking to each other. But it's just, and you're more than welcome to tell me that I should, the heck with all these big clubs that people over here support. We should just all be Bradford fans instead. Maybe that would be easier. I don't know. And I will out myself of how old I am, that when I started watching the Premier League, Bradford were in and around it. Look, it's the unwillingness to have any solidarity.
Yeah.
And I said we go into the muck on some of this stuff, but I try to avoid talking about actual politics, because then I get in trouble at work. Football politics are okay, but actual, and look, it's part of why the Premier League has become the biggest league in the world. But it really is amazing that they just can't, and they can't get out of their own way in all of this comeback stuff anyway, because of the whole spat over neutral sites, which we could do a whole show on. And folks over here have seen the quotes from the various club owners, who are speaking out in their own interest and are not shy about saying, hey, look, I'm just working in my own interest here because I got to stay up so I can have the money.
Yeah. It's quite difficult, because I understand completely and agree with the argument that you're sort of alluding to, this idea that if you are a very rich men's Premier League club that has a women's team, then you can most likely afford to fund the coronavirus. And I think the testing for coronavirus, and I expect that given the amount of money that clubs in particular like Everton, who have just made a huge financial commitment, Man United, City, Chelsea, Arsenal are pumping into the women's game for little financial return at this point, I doubt that they would be unwilling to fund coronavirus testing. I think they've got the resources to it and they might jump on board. I think the issue is that when you're getting into the Championship in particular, or the clubs that are not attached to a men's team or take the name of the men's team but don't have any financial support, or an independently run women's teams, that where are they going to get the money for this testing from, and where are they going to get the money to pay players if games are going behind closed doors and they're not having money coming in from gate receipts, or they're not having the secondary spending of fans going to the ground and buying a beer or buying a shirt or buying a pie or whatever it is. I think that there are so many clubs that are going to be hit harder at the lower level, because we know in the WSL that the vast majority of the clubs are losing $1 million to $500,000 a year, just because of the kind of the way our women's football works over here. The FA have very much gone in going for a fully professional league, for a path where you have rich Premier League clubs bankrolling and funding their women's teams, and the women's teams not generating a profit. But that's not seen as mattering so much to the development of the league, but it's not, in general, it's kind of a hypocritical thing to criticise that, because so many men's clubs are in debt and not making any profit. So it's just sort of seen as the way that the women's game's going at the moment. But the problem is that then alienates or hampers those clubs who are trying to be self-sustaining or who don't have the rich backing of the men's team. So I think that part of the problem is not necessarily if clubs are unwilling to fund coronavirus testing, but it's the fact of how can you support those clubs that aren't attached to a men's team or don't have the funding, and then in turn, how can you justify supporting those clubs, because that's not reward as much. Yeah, it's obviously very easy to justify it in terms of those players have got to be tested, they've got to be safe, because they're humans, they're people, they matter, they've got health concerns. But the problem is with kind of any sort of thing, and we had this discussion a lot, where you are giving money to the bottom teams and pulling the bottom teams up, and the money is coming from a central pot like the Premier League or like the FA, is then where is the incentive for the Man Cities and the Chelseas to keep putting the money into the women's game? Because they might as well say, oh, well, we won't put any money in, and then the FA can give us money and pay for our women's teams. So it's about a wider debate, in addition to all of the points that we've mentioned about helping those clubs, into how can we encourage clubs that are able to, that are rich Premier League teams and rich men's clubs, how can we encourage those to invest more in the women's game? But at the same time, is there a way we can do that while preserving the essence of the game and while making sure there's still a pathway and a place for those clubs that are less rich or less better funded to still very much compete and be a part of the women's game? So I think there were all sorts of discussions about the long-term roadmap for the women's game that coronavirus crisis sort of highlights and brings into sharper focus, I think.
It's interesting. You and I were on a conference call with the leadership of FIFPro, the Global Players Union, a couple weeks ago. And I asked a question on there, and the answer that they gave is not so germane, in part because their head of women's football, Amanda Vandervoort, I've been friends with for a very long time because she's American and she worked in all the leagues over here for many years. But the subject, the question that I asked about, is that the popularity of the Premier League and of English football generally over here brings into some perspective the difference between the big men's clubs running women's teams, so that you have the branding advantage of Chelsea playing Manchester City or Arsenal playing Manchester United. That resonates quite a bit, obviously. Versus over here, even the teams that are part of clubs with men's teams, the Portland Thorns, the North Carolina Courage, etc., they stand on their own financially and sort of image-wise. And part of it is because for trademark reasons, they can't carry the same name as the men's team because of the way the leagues are set up over here. But even so, it may be a side effect of the women's team being Arsenal women, that you want them to stand up on their own as much as they can, but at the same time, when the branding is the same and sort of the umbrella is the same, is there up to a point only so much that they're going to be able to until there's a big TV deal? Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, it does, because I think it's very difficult. There's sort of an expectation, I think, that we force on women's clubs that they have to be self-sustaining and they have to stand on their own, which isn't necessarily fair, because when you look at the accounts for men's Premier League and Football League clubs, it's something like 70 odd out of the 92 are running at a loss and are in debt and are not making any money, but they are bankrolled by very rich businessmen and they are seen as more worthwhile because they bring in bigger attendances, even though financially, there's a joke over here, is how do you make a millionaire? You take a billionaire and get him to buy a football club, that they're just black holes that suck kind of money away. But we don't have that expectation on men's clubs. We don't say, oh, that's a waste of money, that's not worth anything, because it's just sort of seen as it's fine to invest money in men's club. But women's sport, why would you ever put your money in women's football? Because look at the crowds, look at the money, it's not worth it. When in reality, it's sort of a similar situation, but on a far smaller financial scale. And I think, I don't know if you're aware over here, but the FA have recently put out the WSL rights and they're trying to sell them for the first time and to get a paid for broadcast deal, because how it currently works and how it's worked for the last few years is that the FA has offered the rights for free for whoever wants them, which in this case has been the BBC and BT Sport, who have covered the production costs and paid for their presenters and paid for the broadcasting trucks and everything to come down, and they've got the content for free. So it's sort of free content in exchange for free publicity is how it's worked. And at the time, I think that was seen as quite successful, because there were a lot of sports that were actually paying people like Sky to come down and give coverage, because there was just so little, or there was a feeling that there was no interest in women's sport at that point. So I think that it's a very good point that you make, that once this new broadcast deal goes out to tender, or if they are getting a profitable broadcast deal, or there is that money there benched for clubs where they all get a certain cut of that pie, you are going to be in a position where women's clubs are a little bit less reliant on men's clubs, because they have that thing that's their own, that is money coming in from somewhere unique to the women's game. I think the problem is that we have going for a fully professional league very early on in the WSL's development, when women's football is not in its infancy, but still you would like to think at the very early stages of its development, is that the FA has kind of gone definitively now down this path where, in order to compete, in order to be one of the big 5 or 6, you are going to rely on a men's club to invest quite heavily. And you've seen that now that Everton have got a new stadium, they've got their men's club putting a lot more money in, a huge investment that they've never kind of had before. And that's them taking it very seriously, where you will see the men's clubs who don't take women's football seriously, the knock-on effect is very obvious, like in Liverpool's case. So I think that it's going to be, the TV deal will help that slightly, but I do think we are probably too far down that path now of, to be a really successful women's team, you do need a big windfall from the men's clubs each year.
And as far as I'm concerned, we mentioned Liverpool just now and earlier. They have no excuse in my book. And not just because of the money that they have, but because Liverpool's women's team has a serious history of success and doing things well. What other questions do I have here on this notes put together? One of the things that we also have over here, in addition to sort of the structure of the leagues, is the sort of strong title of a commissioner of Major League Soccer or the National Football League or Major League Baseball or so on. And I was having this conversation with somebody you and I both know well, Rob Harris of the Associated Press recently, that English football does not have a commissioner, neither at the Premier League level or at the WSL level, or the Premier League has a CEO in Richard Masters. But the title of commissioner over here comes with a certain sort of layer of expectation that at some points you're going to put your fist down and say, no, this is what we're doing. And everybody does it. And yes, a commissioner serves at the pleasure of the owners, but the owners empower the commissioner to sometimes tell them what to do. And look, Richard Scudamore was pretty good at it. I didn't agree with everything he ever said, but he had the ability to sort of take the iron fist and put it down on the table. And I don't see anybody doing that in England right now.
What do you mean in terms of the WSL?
In terms of any of it.
I'm sort of difficult because I'm not an expert on sort of the men's Premier League by any means. But I think it just goes broader back to that point of when you have a Premier League that stands on its own entity. And I know that you just said, we were saying this earlier, that the MLSs and all the kind of leagues are their own separate things. But I think that when you have in particular one that's got the financial might of the Premier League and is leading all the discussions here about coronavirus, Project Restart, because of the global power and the number of podcast deals. I mean, you will know in America that you can go into a bar on a match day in the Premier League and people are there in full Chelsea and Arsenal kits and the bar's all decked out and everything, because it's just such a huge global corporation worldwide, that when you've got a league like the WSL that has so little financial might in comparison, and the FA that has very little power over this separate entity, even though that entity has a vested interest in the WSL because they've got teams peppered through that are funded by the Premier League teams, it's very difficult. And the West Ham thing that we were talking about earlier is a prime example to make sure that the interests of the WSL are at the forefront of the Premier League. And I think that, well, the worrying thing is that there was talk not long ago of maybe the Premier League taking over the WSL because they've turned this league that was started in 1992 into this massive global phenomenon, and could they do the same for women's football? And I think it's just a case of how can we convince everybody that women's football is worth investing in, and what do we want it to look like? Do we want it to look, our women's football landscape to be, you can only compete at the top if you are an arm of a rich Premier League club or a rich men's club? Or are we wanting to reach a point where you can have enough fans and enough people getting through the gates, enough merchandise sales, enough sponsorship, and a TV deal in particular that can maybe have a little bit more equity in the league? So I think it's probably a question of, at the moment, the FA seemed to set its stall out when it just went for a fully professional league and was like, this is how we do it. You're going to need a lot of funding to compete. You're going to need a budget of however much a year. But you need also, I think, to think very clearly about, is that what we want for the women's game, and is that what we want it to be like indefinitely and forever? Or do we want you to be able to have the stories like the Yeovilles, who are coming up naturally, but then they suffered obviously when the division went full-time professional and they couldn't compete with that? So I think in general there's a lot of time to reflect on what route we want the WSL to take and what kind of identity we need it to have.
Well, and that is something else that I was going to bring up, because you have the same debate over here about the relationship between MLS and the NWSL, and there's plenty of people who, for lots of reasons, don't want the men's league running the women's league. They want the women's league doing its own thing. But you know, when you have the fracturing, that might be too strong a word. When you have the sort of the separation of spaces, the way it is in England, I mean, you would think that even if it was just for television purposes or for the purposes of going out and getting, say, you know, some international distribution for these FA WSL games that are broadcast, you know, that the Premier League in an alternate universe would go to its American television partner, NBC Sports, which their corporate parent, Comcast, which is based here in Philadelphia. I can see their headquarters tower at my window, actually. They own Sky. You would think that set of parties could get together and say, hey, while you're here, could you, maybe, we know there's interest in women's football in the United States. How about you put some of the big WSL games, when Chelsea play Arsenal or Man City or something like that, take a couple games and put them on over there for people to watch. But there's not even that, because they're so, siloed.
Well, that's really interesting, because I've never had that thought at all. And it's interesting that I've never had that thought, because we hear every couple of years about the big bidding wars when Amazon first came on board wanting to buy TV rights to the Premier League, and the number of countries that they're broadcasting and the number of hours that they're broadcasting. And even the EFL over here, that Sky's EFL coverage, which is the English Football League, the Championship League 1 and League 2, is something like 110 games a year. So it's just when people say, oh, there's too much women's football on telly and it's being shoved in our faces, it's kind of nothing compared to the Premier League's reach in England, let alone globally. So it's kind of a bit of a daft argument that people peddle, but I think it's a really good point in terms of why can't you have if the Premier League were involved and they were trying to tender the WSL rights abroad, then you would have that growth and interest you imagine. But I think the 2 points are, one, do you want the WSL to be able to stand on its own and for its TV rights to be able to be sold off the fact that it is the WSL rather than a link or as part of a Premier League TV package? And then number two, do you reach a point there when the only games that are of interest, at least from a broadcast perspective, is Arsenal, Chelsea, Arsenal, Man United, Chelsea, Man City, the kind of big names in the big three, and I would throw Everton in there because I think in the next few years, even though they don't have that international reach, they're really going to become a real big player in women's football, and which is sort of fine. But then the issue with that is, are you then leaving behind the Bristol Cities, the Birminghams? So there needs to be a way that we have some broadcast deal that pulls the bottom clubs up and the lesser funded clubs up as well, in addition to promoting the best matches of the WSL and the best teams in the WSL and the kind of real ones that you automatically, when you're watching Men's Premier League, like, oh yeah, they're a massive club, I know who they are, even if you've never heard of women's football. So I think it's a balance between how can you market WSL on its own, how can you market the TV deal in a way that encompasses all the clubs, and how can you at the same time showcase the best of the women's game. So I think there's a few things that you would have to think about that, but it's interesting that I never thought of maybe if the WSL did come in control of the Premier League, which I don't think it's looking likely that it will now. It would be interesting to see what consequence that would have from a TV rights perspective, if any.
And it's, I should note, that's not just here. I mean, I look at what I would say the 3 or 4 big European women's leagues, England, Germany, France, and maybe if you want to say Spain, because Barcelona and Atletico Madrid have gotten pretty good in recent years. But, you know, the Frauen Bundesliga is coming back next weekend. And I know that the Bundesliga has done some deal, the Bundesliga writ large, the DFL, has done some global broadcast deals for the Frauen Bundesliga in the last couple of weeks. I don't think they've done one in the United States yet. I hope they do. But the bigger PSG women's games are on TV over here because they're owned by, they're owned by Qatar. We know that, but they're beIN Sports, which is the sort of, the global broadcast network that the Qataris run. They have a channel over here, and they've been putting PSG's Women's Champions League games on over here, and people have watched them. And they put the French women's national team games on over here, and people have watched them. So there's, and the U.S. obviously we know is a special market when it comes to women's football. And you've been over here, you've seen it, and you were at the World Cup last summer, and you've seen how just bonkers the fan base is over here.
Yeah.
But it's just an example, of there is the potential, if you get some smart enough people in the room, to figure this stuff out. I want to ask you something else while we're here, and it has to do with the Telegraph and the work that you've done, and the investment that there has been in Telegraph women's sport, which is on the English media landscape a big deal.
Yeah.
And it got the Telegraph out ahead of some of the other major newspapers in England. If folks have probably heard of The Guardian because they have a big U.S. presence. They might have heard of The Times or The Independent and some of the others. And certainly the tabloids that go running amok all summer with transfer rumors that they want you to believe whether or not they're true. But I maybe didn't say that out loud. I'm going to say this part, not so that you don't have to per se, but I don't want to get you in trouble about it, but I'm just going to say it so that I'm the one saying it. People who listen to this show might know that the Telegraph is the politically conservative of the major newspapers in England, and therefore, if you know the media landscape as an outsider, you might not have expected the Telegraph specifically to be the paper that makes the big advancement in coverage of women's sport. But they have. They've done a very good job of it. Anna Kessel, your editor, has led the way. And obviously, you've been at the forefront as the football reporter. How much of an impact has it had over there?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, it's interesting that I was thinking on sort of a variation of that question to myself the other day, because when I started there, so I started about 6 months before the Telegraph Women's Sport Initiative got launched, and the focus was very much on human interest element of women's sport. So it was kind of when the 2015 World Cup, which was when women's football really, I don't want to say took off, but kind of was a massive leap for women's football over here, for England to have that bronze medal, for the games to be on the BBC. And it was the first time that a lot of people had sort of engaged with this team, and you had players like Casey Stoney, who's obviously now the Manchester United manager, had just had her twins at that point, or rather her partner had the twins, and they'd just become mums, and their kids were going to the games, and she was talking about, you know, living in the hotel with them and the kids being there and stuff like that. And then you had Karen Carney talking about her mental health, and you had Frank Kirby talking about the death of her mum, and you had Farrah Williams talking about her homelessness. You had so many people telling their stories, these athletes telling their stories for the first time, and people hearing them and being, wow, aren't these women inspirational, in addition to just the fact that you have to have a certain level of resilience to be a female footballer because of the barriers that are put in your way right from the first moment you kick a ball and you're told girls can't play football. So that was the focus that we carried through, and my approach to it, and it still is to a certain extent, because ultimately if a person's got a good story and tells it well, then it makes for a nice piece. Whereas now there's been a big shift in, particularly with the supplement. If people don't know, in America we have a 16-page supplement every month that's got a particular theme. So it might be about motherhood or LGBTQ or periods, or I don't think they've done a periods one actually, but they have done a lot of period research, concussion or whatever it is. And with these specific themes, there's a real focus now on why isn't the information out there for women athletes, why isn't there a focus on this sort of thing scientifically. And you are learning all the time that a lot of the studies around female sport and a lot of the information that we know about women and sport injuries and welfare are all kind of very rudimentary or in their infancy. So it's only for the first time now that we're really seeing societally everybody interrogate, why do women players have more ACL injuries? Why are we not talking about periods? Why are we not talking about this? So I think it's been interesting since the time that I've been there, is that the landscape has shifted, and I think that a lot of the people who have done a lot more about this than I have at the Telegraph can take a big slice of credit for this, is that the landscape is very much focusing on why are there gaps in our knowledge? Why has this not been talked about before? Why are we not doing better about these key issues?
Thank you to Katie Whyatt of The Telegraph and to Jonathan Tannenwald and Dwayne Rollins for all their hard work. I'm Kevin Laramie, and for Jonathan Tannenwald and Dwayne Rollins, until next time on the Women's Soccer Review, have a great soccer.